Hello and welcome back to the Virtual Classroom AP Euro Edition. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. And this is part 2 or part B of our talk on the Northern Renaissance. Now, as always, take a moment, hit pause on your video, jot down the rest of the lecture outline, and pay particular attention to those key terms at the left. Got it? Let's get started. Now, we left off talking about these famous artists of the Northern Renaissance and how the Northern Renaissance differed from the Italian Renaissance. But one thing we have not talked about, of course, is the role of women. And again, this is a major theme in AP Euro, as it is in every subject, because one of the big problems, historically speaking, when we talk about history, is the absence of women and people of color. And so we, again, trying to focus and bring that voice to the table. And so there were a number of wealthy women during this era, during the Renaissance period. And we will see a new debate develop. And the debate became Querelles de Femmes. In other words, the problem of women. What is the proper role of women in Renaissance society? Now, this is a very short, simple debate. They'll have an answer very quickly. The debate will continue for about 600 years. So how did the role of women, how did life change for women? Well, the reality is women would enjoy increased access to education during this period. So there is that. On the other hand, some would actually lose status compared to women in the Middle Ages. Too often during the Renaissance period, women function now as ornaments of their middle or upper class husbands. In other words, women were to make themselves pleasing to the man. However, don't forget, this only applies to the upper classes, which were the major patrons of the Renaissance period, right? And so women were seen as basically arm candy. They were ornaments to reflect the power and grandeur of their husbands. Now, there continue what is known as a sexual double standard that we'll still see up to the present day. Women are to remain chaste until marriage. If they're not, they're whores. Where men are permitted to sow their wild oats. In other words, boys are going to be boys, they're going to give in to their urges, but women, you better be chaste or you'll be a slut. That's pretty much the definition, sexual double standard. However, despite that, there will be a number of important women who will rise to the occasion and make a name in and of themselves. So there's an important number of Renaissance noblewomen at court, both in education and culture. The first one is Christine de Pizan. Now, she'll be someone we'll see a number of times bring up because she's a very influential woman, historically speaking. Her most famous book is the Book of Three Virtues, in which she chronicles the accomplishments of great women in history. This will be considered a Renaissance woman's survival manual. And you might argue that she is Europe's first feminist. And she's extremely well educated in France. The second lady you should know is Isabelle d'Este. She's a poet. She's known as the First Lady of the Renaissance. And she sets an example for how women to break away from their traditional roles as mere ornaments of their husbands. In fact, the reason she's able to do so is because she will actually rule Mantua after her husband dies.
Good morning, teachers. Stop by the front area. The PPE distribution is now in progress. Pick up your t-shirts, your mask, and your snacks. So come on down.
This is why I do not like recording while I'm at school. Anyway, she and her siblings will be very well educated. And like I said, she will rule Mantua after her husband dies. Again, not very often does this happen. She will also write more than 2,000 letters. You see the book there, there's selected letters of, that she will provide a window into the politics and courtly life at the time. The third woman you should know is Artissima. And she'll be known for many of her Baroque paintings. Again, Baroque's something we haven't discussed yet, so she's a little bit ahead of her time as far as the overall picture. But many of her Baroque paintings, again, we'll talk about Baroque in a future lecture. So that's the next that comes after the Renaissance. But many of her Baroque paintings feature struggle and vengeance. She's the Me Too of her era because she's showing how women are being treated as essentially property or animals or not fully human. And she's becomes the, she is perhaps the first female artist to gain recognition in the post-Renaissance era. She's also the first woman to really paint both historical and religious scenes. She'll paint a number of what's called the Judith paintings. That's fantastic, but how did the average, everyday peasant woman live? Well, their job is family and prostitution, of course. In other words, for lower class women and peasant women, their status largely did not change compared to the Middle Ages. The nuclear family within Europe, poor people tended to be unable to support extended families, so often they lived in small nuclear families. Wealthier parents and some landowning peasants were able to allow, to have extended families live in there as well, but for the most part, peasant families were stuck to the nuclear family. And remember, marriage is not based on love in this period. That's something that comes around 100 or more years later. Instead, it's based on economic considerations. And of course, parents play a large role. Arranged marriages are the norm because dowries are incredibly important in wealthy families, even in common families. And therefore, does give women a role in the economy. Not only are they being somewhat sold with the dowry that makes it important for economic transition or transaction, they also play a huge role in the economy when it comes to farming because they do a lot of the farming also. So they will play a significant role in the economy, especially in Northern Europe. Not so much in Italy. Now, class issues. Well, first of all, the average age for women was under 20 years old for marriage versus mid to late 20s for men. So often their husbands are at least 10 years older than they are. In addition, the rich tend to marry earlier, younger than the middle classes. They can afford to. And poor people also tend to marry earlier too, if they marry at all. In other words, there's an awful number of poor women who don't actually end up marrying. Now, during this period, we will see a low rate of illegitimate births. We will see an increase in infanticide and abandonment, though. Because they don't want to be seen as illegitimate, because they can't afford to take care of them, we'll have increased infanticide and abandonment, especially among the poorer classes who can't afford them. Remember, there's no birth control, and the Catholic Church says there should not be. However, what would rise to take care of these abandoned children is is a phenomenon known as foundling hospitals. Think of them as orphanages. So these abandoned children, again, 2/3 were girls, because girls had a couple issues. One is they were never going to be, the man in society. So there's a decreased economic opportunity because they will have to come with a dowry, which means the family will have to try to, marry them off. And therefore, 2/3 of the abandoned babies were actually female. And they started these foundling hospitals, again, early orphanages, as a way to take in these abandoned kids versus just letting them die. Now, there will also be a couple of, by the way, just women, again, rape is not a serious crime. And in fact, we'll see increased prostitution over the Middle Ages. And again, this is largely because of, the era in which this double standard between men and women, and there's no thought of rape. Last thing is divorce. While it is available in some areas, it is largely non-existent until we get to the Reformation. Now, there will be a number of important female rulers. And again, I am listed there for you. And we'll talk about some of them like the Medicis and Elizabeth I later. Also, Mary Tudor. However, the issue of, did women really have a Renaissance? That's the big question. An historian by the name of Joan Kelly argues that middle-class women, the bourgeois women, suffered especially a marked decline in their status along with noble women during the Italian Renaissance. In other words, they became arm cannon. They became just a, token of their husbands. Middle-class women were exclusively relegated to the private sphere, while men monopolized the political and economic issues in the public sphere. So we start seeing actually a marked decline. Sexual chastity was essential for both women and nobility of the bourgeoisie, but this double standard existed. It was not expected of men. Medieval feudalism permitted homage to female vassals. So you could pay homage to female vassals during the medieval period. However, in Renaissance feudalism, it was replaced by powerful city-states, and thus political power of women vanished. So what you're going to see in the Italian Renaissance is the power of women, which was never great, but it diminished even more, and it basically went gone. Noble women thus experienced a state of almost universal dependence upon their families and husbands. In addition, it was often that women were the ones who educated, especially during the Middle Ages, except for military education. Most tutors were often women. However, during the Renaissance, female tutors were replaced by male humanist tutors and/or boarding schools, and thus reducing the educator influence of women. So did women really have a Renaissance? Well, you know what? I think you'll decide that. And then there's one more big issue, witches. But that's a topic for a later lecture. So until then, take care and bye-bye.